Creator of the Reality Zone Audio Archives and is president of American Media, a publishing and video production company in Southern California. And he is also the founder and president of Freedom Force International. Would you please join me in welcoming G. Edward Griffin.
Thank you, Victor, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Well, we're running late. We've probably lost a few good souls that have to get up in the morning. So I'm going to really cut this short. Fortunately, I was preceded by two excellent speakers. Joan and Tom were able to tell you practically everything I was going to say anyway. I mean, Joan told you how evil the system is. Tom told you how impossibly corrupt and inefficient the system is. So what more can I say? Fortunately, I can rest on their shoulders and not have to do too much explaining, but I know you expect me to say something, so I will say something. I'm going to break this into two parts. The first part will be a very condensed version of an old talk I gave. I haven't given it in quite a while. Many of you may have heard it. It's available on CD, and there's been a lot of pirated copies out there. Millions, I suspect. That makes me feel very good. Most people think the title of that audio presentation was The Creature from Jekyll Island, because that's what it says on the cover. But when I gave the talk, I really had another title in mind. It was really called An Appearance of the Fourth Kind. And those of you who have heard it will catch on right away as to what the connection is. The reason for that title is that I was referring to a quotation I ran across from an ancient philosopher from the 3rd century BC, I believe it was. His name was Epictetus, and he came from the tiny little kingdom of Phrygia. And he said a lot of interesting things, but one thing jumped right off at me. He said this. He said, appearances are of four kinds. Things either are as they appear to be, or they neither are nor appear to be, or they are but do not appear to be, or they are not and yet appear to be. Everyone got that? Confusing, huh? I had to laugh when I read that, because I thought, you know, if Epictetus were alive today, he'd probably be chairman of the Federal Reserve System. Trying to explain how the system works. And I like the quote because it's kind of a mind twister, and really all Epictetus was saying something very simple. He said appearances are four kinds. Either things are or they aren't. There's two. Or they can appear to be just the opposite of what they are, and that's the four. They can appear to be the opposite of their reality. So why did he just say that instead of the way he did? But the point is that if there's anything which is an appearance of the fourth kind, it's the Federal Reserve System, and I know you remember that, the fourth kind. Those things that are not and yet appear to be. That's a perfect description of what the Federal Reserve System is all about. And so I'll be talking a little bit about that, and then I'll get into more current events, things that more folks are interested in today, what's happening on the world scene. What about all these bailouts and all this money being created out of nothing and so forth? And then a brief look at where we're headed if we're not careful, if we don't turn this thing around. And then maybe a very brief look at what we can do about it. But before we get started with all of that, the most important part of my presentation are the jokes. So let me start by giving you two jokes. Genie jokes. I love genie jokes. And the first joke is the story of a little kid that was going through the alley, and he came across this old dirty bottle, and he rubbed it a little bit, took the cork out, and of course, you know, the smoke came out, and there was the genie standing in front of him, and he said, "You have released me from the prison of the ages, and I will now grant you 3 wishes. And the kid said, "Gosh, that's wonderful, Genie. I've always wanted a new bicycle." The genie said, "Vroom, there's your bicycle." That was very good. The kid said, "I want a new basketball." "Vroom," said the genie, there was a new basketball. Finally, the kid said, "This is wonderful, genie. You know I'm thirsty. Make me a malted." And the genie said, "Vroom, you're a malted." Silly, huh? Okay, the next genie joke is even worse. Fellow walks into a bar with an ostrich. And he goes up to the bar, and they both sit on the bar stool, and the bartender comes over with his eyes as big as saucers. He's never seen an ostrich at his bar before. And he said, "What can I get for you?" And the guy said, "Well, I want a whiskey sour." And he turned to the ostrich and he said, "Would you like a whiskey sour, or what would you like?" And the ostrich said, "Oh, a whiskey sour would be fine. You know, I always like what you do and what you drink, and so if you like a whiskey sour, that would be fine." So they ordered the 2 whiskey sours. The bartender came back and said, "Would you like another?" He said, "No, thank you." He said, "How much will that be?" So the bartender looked at the tab, and including the tax, it was $14.44. So the fellow reached in his pocket and pulled out everything he had, and dumped it on the bar, sorted it out, and it was $14.44 exactly to the penny. The next day, they came back, the same fellow, the same ostrich, and ordered some more drinks. This time they wanted a different drink. They wanted whiskey sours. But that was his first drink. This time they wanted a margarita, a different drink. And he asked the ostrich, "Would you like a drink?" And the ostrich says, "Oh, yes. Whatever you drink is fine with me. You know, whatever you do, I like." And so they ordered the second drink and asked how much it was. And well, this one was $15.22, including tax. The fellow reached in his pocket, pulled out everything he had, sorted it out, and it was $15.22 exactly. This went on every day for a week. And finally, at the end of the week, after each day being a different drink and a different amount, the fellow always had the exact amount of money in his pocket. The bartender couldn't take it anymore. He turned to this fellow and said, "Now look, I've never had an ostrich in my bar before, and that's most amazing. But even more amazing than that to me is how it is that every day, no matter what the charge is, you reach in your pocket, you pull out everything you have, and it's exactly correct to the penny. How do you do that?" The fellow said, "Well, let me tell you a little story. One day I was walking through the alley. I came across this bottle, and it was all dirty. I rubbed it off, pulled the cork out, and out came the smoke, and there was a genie standing over me. And the genie said, 'You have released me from the prison of the ages, and now I will grant you 2 wishes.' The fellow said, 'Wow, 2 wishes.' He said, 'All right, I better be good on these wishes.' He said, 'Let me think. The first wish. Genie, I wish that no matter what I want in life, no matter how expensive it is, or how hard to find, or how ridiculous it may seem, I may always be able to afford it. No matter what it costs, I want to be able to afford it.' The genie said, 'Vroom, your wish is granted.' And the guy said, 'You know, ever since that day, wherever I went, no matter what I wanted, whether it was a drink in a bar, or a yacht, or a trip around the world, no matter what it costs, I reach in my pocket and I pull out exactly the right amount of money. It doesn't make any difference.' The bartender said, 'That's amazing.' He said, 'What was the other wish?' He said, 'Well, the other wish,' I looked at the genie and I said, 'You know, genie, I've always wanted a chick with long eyelashes and long, slender legs that always agreed with me.'" Okay. Believe it or not, there's a connection between those genie jokes and my short, hopefully short presentation here tonight. And the connection is this, that we should be very careful what we wish for, because it may not be exactly what we think it's going to be. And that certainly applies to the topic that I'm addressing here tonight. In order to shorten this, fortunately, I did do some preparation, and I decided to take these 2 parts of the talk and condense them down into sound bites, 1 sentence. That's kind of a good disciplinary move to make if you ever have to make a complex presentation. If you can get it all said in 1 sentence, then you're in good shape, because you at least be able to crack the run on it. So I've got 2 sentences here which are sound bites, but they actually say everything that I want to say. And to a large extent, they say what the previous speakers have already said. But here they are. Sound bite number 1. In 1913, the Federal Reserve System was created because Americans made a wish to the government genie to control the banks on behalf of the people. But what they got was a banking cartel that now controls the government. Soundbite number 2. Today, Americans are making another wish to the government genie, this time to create unlimited quantities of money to protect them from hardship. But what they are getting is unlimited quantities of money being used to deprive them of their freedom. That is everything I want to say, and the more you dig into the wealth of information that backs those statements up, the more you realize how really profound they are. So let's get right to the first part, and this is where I'm going to have to do quite a bit of trimming in the interest of time, but fortunately I think many of you here probably already know the story about Jekyll Island and why I called my book The Creature from Jekyll Island. Just for those of you who may not know about it, I had fun thinking as I was finishing the book and struggling for a title, thinking that The Creature from Jekyll Island might fool some people. I had fun thinking in my mind's eye that somebody might be walking by a bookstore and see my book in the window and they say, oh, this is a sequel to Jurassic Park or something like that, and go buy the book thinking it was a monster story. Believe it or not, tonight, in that little room to the right of the stage, or to your left of the stage, I was talking with Joan Leon, and she said that is exactly what happened to her. She said she bought the book after visiting Jekyll Island some years ago, and she bought it more or less as a joke to give to her brother, I believe she said, thinking it was a monster story, and after she got reading it, she said, oh my gosh, this is really a story about a monster. But it actually happened that way. Well, I didn't expect it would, but I did know that a lot of people would find the title intriguing. That's all I had hoped to accomplish. But the title is meaningful because, as many of you know, the Federal Reserve System was created on Jekyll Island. It's a real island. It's off the coast of Georgia. And it was on that island back in 1910 that the Federal Reserve System was created. And when I discovered that fact in the early days of my research, I was intrigued because I also discovered that there was a lot of secrecy surrounding this meeting. The men who went there, the 7 men who went there, denied that they were going. After they came back, they denied that they had been there. When they took the trip, they had adopted all kinds of secrecy practices, not to be seen together. On the night of their departure, they all left one evening in November aboard the private railroad car of Senator Nelson Aldrich. And when they were told that when they got on board this private car, even then they were to address each other by first names only, not to use their last names. And 2 of the men even abandoned their first names and adopted code names. And all these secrecy provisions, and I couldn't find out why at first. And then, of course, I did, and I'll explain that in just a moment. And it was explained by one of these men who wrote quite a bit about it in later years, that the reason for this not using the code, not using the real names, and in fact adopting code names, is because they were afraid that the servants on board the train might find out who all of these people were. All of a sudden. Of course, the servants knew who Nelson Aldrich was. He was an employer. And they might have known the names of 1 or 2 of the others, but not all of them. And they were afraid that if the servants talked and said, do you know who was all on this train and went down to Jekyll Island, down to Georgia and then across the Straits of Jekyll? And they were afraid that if the word leaked out in that fashion, it would subvert the whole purpose of the meeting. So let me fast forward to all of this. The meeting was actually held on Jekyll Island, which was a private club in those days, called the Jekyll Island Club, privately owned by a small group of billionaires from New York, people like J.P. Morgan and William Rockefeller and their business associates. It's where their families went to spend the cold winter months, get away from New York. You can visit the island today and see their mansions. They call them cottages, but beautiful mansions, great examples of the architectural style of the period. But the main showpiece is the clubhouse. It's still there. It's being operated by the Marriott Hotels today. And you can go, have a nice lunch, and you can go visit the room down at the end of the hallway on the main floor. Just before you exit the door, exit the outside door, turn to your left, and you'll see an inside door with a plaque on it that says Federal Reserve Room. And this is where the Federal Reserve was actually created. You go in there, on the wall are pictures of the men. So there's no secret about this now. In fact, when I went to Jekyll Island years ago, I was very well served by the friendly and helpful staff, the ladies there in the library were anxious to open up their files and show me the photographs and the personal correspondence and the memorabilia that they had from the period. They're very proud of these famous men who were there. And I found out later that most of these details can be confirmed in any major, well-stocked public library, but I certainly didn't hear any of this when I was studying economics in school. And this information is not well known, but it's certainly not secret either. Well, the reason, let's cut right to the chase. I could go through all of this. I could tell you who these men were and so forth. The reason for the secrecy. I knew then that when you do something in secret, there's usually something to hide. And the question always comes up, why? Why were they doing this, and what were they trying to hide? The answer is very clear. The purpose of the Federal Reserve Act is it was sold to the American people in 1913. Remember, that's 3 years after this Genesis meeting I'm talking about. It was enacted into law 3 years later, but all of the provisions were drafted in 1910. The purpose of that act, as it was sold to the voters, was that it was to break the grip of the money trust. That's the phrase they used in those days, the money trust this, the money trust that. The public was very concerned about the concentration of financial power in the hands of a few large financial institutions on Wall Street. They wanted their trustworthy politicians to draft a law that was going to control the banks. And they knew that the politicians would be able to do that if they just drafted a good law. And that was the purpose of the Federal Reserve Act, basically. Well, it turns out, when you look at the list of these people that went to that meeting, they were the money trust. That's the bottom line. There were 7 of them: Nelson Aldrich, Abraham P.F. Andrew, Frank Vanderlip, Harry Davison, Charles Norton, Benjamin Strong, Paul Warburg. And when you look at the wealth which they held personally, and particularly the wealth of the firms which they represented not only the great banking dynasties of the United States, but also Paul Warburg, for example, in his partnership in Kuhn-Loeb Company, was a representative of the Rothschilds in England and France. And Warburg himself maintained a very close liaison with his brother, Max Warburg, who was head of the Warburg Banking Consortium in Germany and the Netherlands. And when you look at all of the wealth which these banking and insurance conglomerates held, according to the estimates at the time, taken from papers like the New York Times, that represented approximately 1/4 of the wealth of the entire world. These 7 men represented 1/4 of the wealth of the entire world. This was, ladies and gentlemen, the money trust. If there ever was one, this was it. And that's the reason for the secrecy. Even Frank Vanderlip himself, who was one of the participants, admitted that. In an article that was published in the Saturday Evening Post, February 9, 1935, Vanderlip said, quote, "If it were to be exposed publicly that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress." Of course, because the scam would have been out. Even today, people have no idea that the Federal Reserve was created by the very banking institutions which they thought, or still think today, is being controlled by the government. Well, there's something else that we should learn about that, and I don't have time to go into all of the details, but I'll jump again right to the chase. When you look at these men and the institutions which they represented, prior to this period in history, they were competitors. I mean, these were the giant firms that were fighting against each other, struggling for dominance in the world's markets, in Paris and London and in New York, blood all over the battlefield as they struggled for dominance. But at this point in history, which was the turn of the century, A great change was taking place in the way America was doing business. We were moving rapidly from the old style, I may say that now, old style of free enterprise competition to the new style of monopoly and cartels. The giants such as Rockefeller and Carnegie, you know the name well, had reached the pinnacle of success. They dominated their industries primarily through competition, but now that they were there, they wanted no one else to do that. And so they adopted the slogan of Rockefeller himself, who said, "Competition is a sin." He's quoted by all of the biographers on that. And it became the great movement among the captains of industry in America now to get rid of competition and to form liaisons with government, to get laws written to give them favored positions, to form monopolies and cartels. And then when you look at this group and you see what actually happened there, you realize that the Federal Reserve System is a cartel. That's the best way to describe it. When people ask me, what is the Federal Reserve System? Is it a government agency? Is it a private corporation? It is neither. It is a hybrid, but it's the embodiment of something called a cartel. It's a group of the largest and most powerful banks in America. They formed together, created a cartel agreement to regulate their own industry, and then by hook or crook, they got these congressmen in Washington to pass their cartel agreement into law. What a coup that was. You know, cartels have a problem. I don't care whether it's a banking cartel or a banana cartel or an oil cartel or sugar cartel. How do you keep the members of the cartel in line? How do you keep them so that they'll honor their agreement? If they're going to fix prices or limit production or whatever they do to enhance their position in the market, how do you keep them to their agreement? And of course, there are only two ways. And the old way, of course, is to get Guido or some underworld figure to sort of show up in the middle of the night and make it clear that you shouldn't break the rules of the cartel. It's a nasty way of doing things. And the other way is much cleaner and much more respectable, and that's to go into partnership with the government. Now you pass your cartel agreement into law, and you can rely on the police and the armies to enforce your cartel agreement. And Guido is out of a job. Or unless he runs for president or something like that. But it's a much nicer way of enforcing cartel agreements, which is why you find that most monopolies, not most, all I say, all monopolies and cartels in recent history are in partnership with their respective governments. So we come to the amazing conclusion that the Federal Reserve System is a banking cartel. Now, it has the appearance of being a government agency because their cartel agreement was enacted into law, and so therefore, if you don't go along with their agreement, you go to prison, and that seems like you're being challenged by the government. Well, the government is being used, yes, is being used to enforce the cartel agreement, but that does not mean that the Federal Reserve System is a government agency, because it is not. It's not strictly a private corporation either, although it is a corporation chartered by Congress, but it has none of the traditional characteristics of a privately held corporation. By that I mean, if you own stock in a corporation, your shares of ownership entitle you to select or at least vote for the board of directors, right? This does not happen with the Federal Reserve System. The member banks hold the shares of stock, technically. All the banks in the system have some shares, but they can't vote those shares. Just meaningless. If you own shares of any corporation and they're really yours, you can sell your shares, right? Well, you can't sell these shares. It's forbidden by law. So these are not really typically shares of ownership as we think of it in the classical sense. So it has the appearance of being a corporation on one hand, it has the appearance of being a government agency on the other hand, but it is neither of the above. It is a hybrid organization designed specifically for its unique purpose. It is a cartel, a banking cartel, which has enlisted the power of the government as its partner to enforce its cartel agreement. Now, when two people go into partnership on any kind of adventure, there's usually a reason for them to do so. There's a benefit for both parties. So we should take a look briefly at the reason or the benefit for these parties to be in this unholy alliance. The first group, of course, are the politicians. Why do the politicians support this program? Well, a recent look at history certainly answers that question. You can see all the money being created by the Federal Reserve System, being created for what? For political purposes primarily, but yes. But look at the politicians. They're gaining a lot of political mileage on the basis of this. You see, what happens is that when politicians need money and they want to use this money to influence favorable votes, in other words, they want to buy votes by giving away things and providing benefits, all of which cost money. It's easy for them to vote for these programs, but now the other side of the coin is they have to pay for them. But they don't want to raise taxes, because if you raise taxes, that makes you unpopular as a politician. So the trick is, how do you increase spending without increasing taxes? I mean, too far. And the answer, of course, is that you borrow it. And that's the old trick with the rising national debt. Congress is always borrowing money, far more than it is ever taking in taxes. And every year it goes by, they wind up with the old debt coming due, and they still aren't taking enough in taxes to pay for the current program. So now they have to borrow money today in order to pay the interest of the old loan that they borrowed last year, and 5 years ago, and 20 years ago, and so forth. And the thing just keeps growing and growing and growing. None of these people ever expect to pay that back. They know better. They're smarter than the average person. They know that those debts will never be paid back. But they don't care, because the average voter doesn't get it. He thinks that it's just plain a loan, and someday will be paid back. They know better. But the point here is that in spite of the willingness of the private investor and institutions and other governments, in spite of their willingness to loan existing money to the federal government, there's never enough. Government always needs more than that. There's always a shortfall. And that shortfall is where the Federal Reserve System comes in. Now, they get that shortfall by going to the Fed and asking to borrow the money from the Fed, and the Fed says, sure, how much do you want? $1 billion today, or $5 billion, or lately $1 trillion? The numbers are astronomical. It doesn't make any difference. The Fed just says, well, here's your money. They loan it to the federal government. The question arises, where did the money come from? In the case of you or I buying a government bond, or another country, or an investment fund buying government bonds as an investment, that money exists prior to the investment. So there's no new money created there. It's just a loan of existing money. But when they go to the Federal Reserve System, and they get an extra $1 trillion or whatever it is, that money does not exist anywhere in the universe until it's loaned. So it's created, as they say, out of thin air. So this is why politicians are in the game, because they know that no matter what expense they incur, they do not have to raise taxes for it directly, because they can go to their partners, the Federal Reserve System, and by obligation they will create whatever amount of money is necessary so the politicians can continue on their wild spending spree. Of course, there's a consequence to that. We'll talk about that in a moment, but that's why the politicians like this system very much. Thank you. But there's another reason for this to exist, and that's why the banks are in this situation. If you think this is interesting, creation of money out of nothing for the Federal Reserve System, now take a look at the banking side. Let's take, for an example, that we just created $1 trillion out of nothing and loaned it to the federal government. And now the government takes let's say $1,000 of it and writes a check to the postal worker who delivers our mail. He's a federal employee, he gets a $1,000 check. And as far as he's concerned, this is good money. He doesn't realize that it didn't exist anywhere in the universe until yesterday. But it doesn't make any difference. It's a government check, nothing better than that. And so he takes it down the street now and deposits it into his personal checking account in the private bank down the street. And this is where the action really heats up. So he walks into the bank and deposits $1,000, and if I were the president of the bank, I'd be able to say to everybody in the bank, attention everybody, this gentleman here just deposited $1,000 into our venerable bank, and we have money to loan. It's wonderful, everybody likes that, money to loan. The more money you have to loan, generally, the lower the interest rates. And this gentleman might say here, well, how much do you have to loan? How much did he deposit? I would say, well, he deposited $1,000. You might say, well, that's not what I need $9,000, thank you. I need to buy a second used car, so we can take the kids to school and so forth. And I need $9,000. I'm sorry, $1,000 is going to do it. Well, as a good banker, I'd say, sir, don't leave. Come over and sit down at the desk. I can take care of that. And in fact, the truth of the matter is, I can loan him up to $9,000 based on the $1,000 that was deposited into my bank. I can do that because those are the regulations created by the Federal Reserve System cartel. Those are their internal regulations allowing themselves to do it. But now it's law. So you and I were to do that, of course, we'd go to jail, but we weren't smart enough to buy enough politicians to pass into law our nefarious schemes. So they can do it. And as a matter of fact, that is exactly what they do. That's the maximum at the moment, but there's no theoretical limit. They could change 9 to 1 to 20 to 1 to 50 to 1. They could take all limits completely off the debt if they wish to. And I think they're coming to that point now. It's just a formality. So that means for every $1 billion created out of nothing for the federal government, by the time it gets into the economy, into the private banking system, into the partner side, now it can be expanded up to $9 billion through the banks. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is how money comes into being in America and in virtually all of the world today. It's one of the most amazing Ponzi schemes you can possibly imagine, and we've been living under it. We've been accepting it for all of these years. It's been perfectly respectable, mainly because we didn't understand it, and also because everything seemed to be working okay. And now the system is coming undone, it's unraveling, and people are beginning to ask questions. Now, I can't leave this topic without saying that this process that I call the Mandrake mechanism, after that 1940s comic book character, Mandrake the magician, who created things out of nothing and then put things back into the void. I call it the Mandrake mechanism, but this mechanism has consequences. It means that the money supply is constantly being expanded. And although it's theoretically possible that the money supply could remain constant under such a system, the money is created at the point of a loan, and then when the loans are paid back, the money goes out of existence again, theoretically. So you could theorize that, well, the money supply could remain constant under such a system and under wise, benevolent management. The fact of the matter is it never does that, because there is no such thing as wise, benevolent management. These people are crooks. And we got to get that in our mind. They are predators. This system attracts the predator class. And they call themselves bankers, they call themselves statesmen, but they're predators. And so the system historically never works according to the theoretical model. It always works on the basis of being in the hands of predators. And so the money supply expands because it's advantageous to the predators for them to create more money and more money and more money. It expands at a rate faster than the expansion of goods and services. And so you have this disproportionate balance, money increasing faster than goods and services, and we have this thing called inflation. Prices are going up and up. In reality, that's kind of a mistake to think of it that way, because what really is happening is that the value of the money is going down and down. If money were backed by something of tangible value that could not be artificially created out of thin air by the wise and benevolent leaders, then the purchasing power of money would remain amazingly constant over long periods of time. A perfect example is the fact that we had lived in ancient Rome and had a 1 ounce gold coin. We could have purchased a very nice toga, a handcrafted belt, and a pair of sandals. It's about the cost. Today, thousands of years later, we have a 1 ounce gold coin with no numismatic or collector's value, just the value of the gold. We can use it to buy a really nice suit, a handcrafted belt, and a real nice pair of shoes. It's approximately the same purchasing power after thousands of years. Even now, with the value of gold going up rather rapidly, it'll soon lose that relationship. But for thousands of years, our money had been based on gold or silver or something that couldn't just be created out of thin air, something that took human effort to produce, then that money would be used to purchase other things which also took human effort to produce, and that balances the scale. Because if you can buy something for something that takes 10 man-hours to produce, and it only takes you 5 hours to produce the gold or the silver, well then everybody's going to be going into the gold and the silver until finally the gold and the silver supply expands, and then all of a sudden there's more of it and its purchasing power goes back down, so that it takes 10 hours and so forth. It's basically, the system always adjusts itself when it's left to the interaction of millions of people acting in freedom without government decree telling them what they must or must not do. So the bottom line is that this process, this mandrake mechanism, even though it does not appear to be a tax, is very definitely a tax. It is a hidden tax. It's the most severe tax of them all. There are no exemptions, there are no deductions, and it hits the people who can least afford it, hits them the most. Inflation is a tax, and it's the inevitable consequence of this system. So what do we get? Let's summarize. In the Federal Reserve System, we got a corporation chartered by Congress, which is given the exclusive franchise to create the nation's money. What a coup that was. We got a cartel that is a partner with the federal government to enforce the cartel agreement and create the illusion of being a government agency. We got a mechanism whereby Congress can raise unlimited taxes through this process called inflation, without the public even suspecting that they're paying a tax, most of them. We got a law that allows banks to collect interest on nothing. And we got a golden parachute, which we see today, which enables fraudulent banks to pass on their inevitable losses to the taxpayers in the name of rescuing the economy. What a deal. And we got it. We got it because we didn't know about it. We had, in general, the American people had no interest in it, and because they had ultimate faith in their leaders. These are not rescue packages. These are not economic stimulus programs. This, ladies and gentlemen, is legalized plunder of the American taxpayers. Okay, and that brings us finally to the second part, which is today Americans are making another wish to the government genie, this time to create unlimited quantities of money to protect them from hardship. But what they are getting is unlimited quantities of money being used to deprive them of their freedom. Why do most Americans approve of these bailouts? I think mainly it's because most Americans are pretty ignorant of basic economic principles and reality. They are what you might call financially illiterate. They think government money is free. They really do. I saw a video clip of one of these popular daytime television hosts, the kind that grabs the mic and he walks through the audience and gets all these supposedly spontaneous reactions from people. And this one just knocked me off my blocks. He was in there among the people talking about some need. I don't remember whether it was a welfare need or a need for better health insurance or some popular thing like that. And some woman said, yeah, why doesn't the government just pay for these things? They got all the money. Why doesn't the government just pay for everybody's houses? And you know what? The whole room, there must have been 300 people, cheered wildly in acceptance of such an idea. I mean, these people are dumber than dirt. Well, so that's reason number one. They do not understand. Others are desperate, and even though they suspect that this isn't necessarily good for America, they're in desperate needs, and so they kind of look the other way when it comes to ethics is concerned. But the main thing was mentioned earlier by Tom, I believe. He said, no, the debate on television is limited between two false choices. And this is it. When people look at their television and they're trying to think, well, what am I supposed to believe? Who do I agree with? They never get the real option. All they get is, should we give a little bit of money now, or should we give a lot of money now? And the next question is, to whom should we give it? Those are the options we're allowed to consider in the debate. Never in a debate does it ever show up, but we should let the failed, corrupt banks fail. That never comes up as a discussion. With freedom, we can rebuild. It's happened before. It's happened before in America. Early in our history, we've gone through some very rough times, brought about by inflation, as a matter of fact, during the Revolutionary War. But we recovered because we had freedom. People can recover. The economies in Europe have recovered from a devastating war because basically then they had a lot of freedom within which to build. It wasn't all government regulated and controlled. We can get well again, but not if we are force-fed the same toxic poisons that made us sick in the first place. Now, I agree also with somebody who mentioned it today, I've forgotten, I think also Tom, executive salaries and bonuses are a distraction to the real issue. Yes, we can get all whipped up about that. These dirty guys, how come they get all this money and they're the ones that create the problem? But ladies and gentlemen, those issues, the issue of bonuses and salaries is like a grain of sand on the beach compared to the money that's being flooded through into these institutions. And these people are getting them in just normal salaries. But forget the bonuses. The fact they shouldn't be paid 10 cents for what they're doing because they're basically stealing from the American people. And so this issue of bonuses and salaries is a distraction to keep us from looking at the main issue of the system itself. Let's talk about the transfer of wealth. This is brought up by the question of, are we going to have inflation or deflation? What do you think? You know, I get the question all the time. I'll tell you my quick answer, and I'll somewhat longer answer. Quick answer is yes, we're going to have inflation because that's the only trick that these guys know is how to expand the money supply. They don't know anything else. So eventually we're going to have inflation, in my view. But in the short term, we could have a little bit of deflation, certainly in some aspects of the economy, certain markets. And here's why. If you think of the economy as a bucket of water, and here we are. The bucket of water is, let's say, full. And here we are at the top. The Federal Reserve System and our dependable, wise, and benevolent congressmen are voting for the creation of trillions of new dollars being created out of nothing, new water being poured into the top of the bucket. And we see it going in by the trillions. Of course, it's not all there yet. They've announced it, and some of it's on its way, but it's coming in now. And yet, the bucket isn't overflowing as much as we thought. Why is that? It's because if you look at the bottom of the bucket, there are huge holes. And the water is rushing out of the bucket at the same time that it's coming in at the top. And those holes are the loss of asset value. People are losing the values in their homes, for example. Their savings are spent. Now the average American is in negative savings. Used to have positive savings, now in negative savings. Those asset values are gone. People are losing their jobs. They've had to sell off one of their cars. They've gotten rid of their second home, their vacation home. The value of their stocks has dropped. And all of these things which used to go into the value, or at least the measure of the money supply, are shrinking. They're coming out at the bottom of the bucket. And so it seems that the total quantity of money is remaining fairly constant for the moment. And it is. But there's another thing to watch, very important. And that is that while the money at the bottom is going out, who's losing that money? It's the middle class. The middle class is at the bottom of the bucket, losing the water. At the top of the bucket for the fresh money coming in, now we've got the politically favored class, the executives, the politicians, the bankers. So even though the total money supply may at the moment remain fairly constant, we see an upward shifting of wealth away from the middle class up into the politically favored class. So now the rich truly are getting richer, and the poor truly are getting poorer. So we're seeing a wider gap in the economic distribution of wealth while this process is going on. And it's not just the rich, it's the politically favored rich. It used to be that you could get rich by free enterprise competition. You could build a better mousetrap. Today, you can't build a better mousetrap without permission of OSHA and some other government agency, and then you have to ask for permission to sell it, and then, you know how that goes. All right, so that's the problem. What do we call this? Well, some people call it communism, some people call it fascism, some people call it socialism. I think it's time for us to adopt a new word, a better word than all of that. The real word is collectivism. We have to get used to the idea that all of these isms, communism, fascism, Nazism, socialism, you peel them off, they're like labels. Peel off the label and look underneath. You'll recognize there's a common denominator to them all, and that is properly called collectivism. This is not the purpose of my presentation tonight, but I hope you'll come to our Freedom Force website someday and see what we have to say on that. One of the basic doctrines of collectivism is this, I will mention this, that the group is more important than the individual, that the individual must be sacrificed if necessary for the greater good of the greater number. That is the underpinning of collectivism. You'll find that in fascism, Nazism, New Dealism, neoconism, all of the isms, it's all there. And unfortunately, many Americans today still endorse that. I was taught that in school. It took me a long time to figure out the trick on that. And there is a trick to it. The main trick is that there is no such thing as a group. That's a word. It's an abstract word. It's a concept. It's an abstraction for a concept of many individuals. But all there are, in reality, are individuals. It's like the word forest. No such thing as a forest. You can't touch a forest. You can't see it. All you can touch and see are trees, but we use the word forest as an abstraction for the concept of many trees. The word group is exactly like that. We think it's a real thing. It isn't. The only thing that's real are individuals. And so when we say that the individual must be sacrificed for the greater good of the group, we are making a huge mistake intellectually and politically. What we're really saying is that some individuals must be sacrificed for other individuals, and it's all going to be decided by the leader who will tell us that it's for the greater good of the greater number. It's a trick. And we'll never solve our political dilemma in America until we learn that trick and we stop going for these old words that just confuse us. So what we're dealing with now today is the growth of collectivism worldwide. And we're hearing it referred to more and more as the New World Order. When you examine that label and pull it off, the New World Order or global government, you find out that it is collectivism on an international level. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with world government. I would be all for world government if it were based on the concept of individual freedom and rights and guarantees like we used to have in our Constitution. If it were a system that ensured freedom of choice, gave everyone the right to have a different viewpoint, to have their own cultural preferences, without trying to crush them into the same mold, I think it would be wonderful. But that is not the kind of global government that's being built today. The kind that's being built today is on the model of collectivism, which is totalitarian control at the top, with the leaders telling the people at the bottom what they must do for the greater good of the greater number. So that's what's happening to us, and if we get our words straightened out, we'll be able to see it a little more clearly and maybe to explain it to our friends that need to hear about this too. So how do we slay this creature from Jekyll Island and its siblings? Well, it can be done. We can do it just the same way the creature was created, which was through Congress. We can uncreate it through Congress. But let's face it, that's going to take a lot of work. Do you think the congressmen we have now are going to do that? No. They're totally in the pocket of the system. People say, well, write to your congressman. I said, oh, that's a good idea if you want to practice penmanship. For the most part, your congressmen are the problem. They're a part of the problem. They need to get removed. That's what you should be doing, is joining with us and others who are trying to change the complexion of Congress. Then, and only then, do we have a chance of getting rid of the creature. We must recognize that the creature controls both major political parties today. Again, that may shock some of you, but if you have any question about it, maybe I can come back someday and talk on that issue. I call it the Quigley formula. And you'll see, if you come to our website, the Freedom Force website, that there's a couple of essays on that. And I think I can prove to your satisfaction that there's another scam that we've been taken in on. Is the idea that if we can just vote Republican or vote Democrat without realizing that they're both controlled at the top by the same people and both endorsing the same long-range policies. And if that doesn't become clear in the last few administrations, I don't know what will. But the point I'm trying to make is that it didn't happen by accident. It's been going on for a long time. In fact, it's been going on since Woodrow Wilson. That's when it really began. I'll give you just a little peek at this, since you're so responsible, and I'm getting very close to the end, but you encourage me, it's your fault. I'll give you a little peek as to what this Quigley formula is all about. Quigley is named after Professor Carroll Quigley, who was a well-known college professor at Georgetown University. He was one of William Clinton's mentors when Bill Clinton was a student there. And it was Quigley that I think, I'm pretty sure, got Clinton into the Rhodes Scholarship, the Rhodes program. And Quigley is considered to be the historian of the world's greatest conspiracy that exists today. He's recognized worldwide as the historian of a conspiracy, and I use the word advisedly, created by Cecil Rhodes. And he documents it all. And he's very proud of it. He says his only disagreement with it is that it wishes to remain unknown. And so he's writing the history of this. He says he was admitted to their private papers for a period of years. He knows the members intimately. He's seen their private papers. He's studied them. He's followed them around the globe. And he is their historian. Most people don't know that. Clinton knew it. And his students know it because that's what he teaches. He teaches the glories of this group created by Cecil Rhodes, and which was then formed in all of the major dependencies of the British Empire, and then outward beyond that, including the United States. And he said they adopted a particular strategy called rings within rings within rings, which is taken directly from Adam Weishaupt. If anybody's studied that, and we know what Adam Weishaupt taught, wrote about, because when the Illuminati was broken up by the Bavarian government, those papers were seized, and they're in the London Museum right now. And you can see photocopies on the internet. And it was the creator of the Illuminati that said we should have rings within rings within rings with the control in the center, and then the center man and maybe three people in the very core of the movement, and then around them they would select maybe a dozen people or 20 people who would not know that there was an inner group directing them. They would think they were the whole thing. And then around them there'd be another group created with perhaps 1,000 or 2,000 people, and they would not know that they're being directed by an inner core. And then around them they would create a huge organization, maybe a political movement, and they would not know that they were directed by an inner core. And that's the rings within rings. And it's well known for anybody that's read Weishaupt stuff. I was just shocked when I read it in the words of Cecil Rhodes. And we know a lot about this from people other than Carroll Quigley, because one of the best sources of information is a book written by William Stead, who was Cecil Rhodes' executor of his estate. He's part of that group. And William Stead explained that this was a movement to conquer the world silently from behind the scenes with them, with no one knowing who was doing it. Anyway, that's just a little teaser for this whole topic. There's so much more to it than that, but the reason I chose the Quigley formula as the topic for this issue of the political parties is that Quigley finally comes to a section in one of his books called Tragedy and Hope, and he asks the question, well, how do we control the masses? In this world where people in advanced countries, in developed countries especially, expect to be, to have control over their own political destiny. They have the vote. How do we control the masses and still let the people vote? And he says the answer is simple. Give them two political parties and we'll control them both. And let them beat their heads out, bouncing from one to the other. And no matter which way they go, we direct them. That is the Quigley formula. And that has been in place since Woodrow Wilson in the United States. And we didn't even know it. But we should know it now. You can see it now. So how do we slay this creature? We're back to that again. We've got to recognize the Quigley formula. We've got to recognize that those guys in Washington who parading around as Democrats or Republicans are part of the problem. We've got to replace them with real Americans who have no axe to grind, who are not dedicated to collectivism by whatever name. And we've got to get out of our homes and off our couches, and we have to get into the groups and organizations where people work and live. And that's why I created Freedom Force International, for those who want to take on that role. If you want to know more about that, I've left a couple of pads here at the corner of the stage. If you want to just give me your email, I'll give you my weekly news service free. And if you don't like it, you can always cancel. And there's some little information cards on Freedom Force. And that's all I'm going to say about that, except that I am sure it can be done. But it's not going to be easy, but it can be done. So let me close by inviting you to join with me to put this creature from Jekyll Island back into its bottle and sink it in the deepest sea. And then we'll let freedom and prosperity prevail. Thank you very much.
I'm going to ask Tom to come up here for a second, please. Keep clapping, that's fine.